Good day, everybody, and welcome to this podcast episode of Bündnis Redefreiheit, the Alliance for Free Speech. We are here today with a very special guest, David Starkey. David Starkey is a historian, perhaps the best historian, I would argue, of the entirety of Great Britain, who is not only great at absorbing historical knowledge and analyzing it in a very coherent fashion, he can also analyze things that are contemporary in a very insightful way. And that's why he's here today. Thank you for being here, Mr. Starkey.
A pleasure.
So let us begin with certain contemporary troubles in Britain. There have been certain protests, one especially big in the centre of London, where there were certain figures swaying the national flag and so on. It seems to us in mainland Europe that is kind of a revival of a pride in being British. Could you tell us about what's going on?
Yes, and I think it's both a revival and, to an extent, something new. Traditionally, in Britain, we tended to think that we were so confident about ourselves, our history, our country, our culture, that we didn't really need to make a very big fuss about it. In contrast, we always, I remember growing up, used to laugh rather at America. And I remember when I first started visiting America regularly now, well, actually a very long time ago, I was struck by the fact most American houses, great many, particularly suburban. It's very much a phenomenon of American suburbia, which really is, I suppose, the real America, is every house flies the American flag. That would be simply unthinkable, or would have been. Let's have that past conditional, would have been unthinkable in Britain. Yes, public buildings fly appropriate flags. Yes, there are regimental flags that I still remember when the British Army was very much larger than it is now. The local regiments would have a regimental chapel in a local church or local cathedral, and you would have the arrayed battle flags, national flags. You would have Union Jacks that had been at, for heaven's sake, Waterloo or whatever, that would be these shot up emblems of battle and whatever. But we didn't walk around with them. We didn't have them pinned to our lapels. Our Prime Minister didn't stand in front of them the whole of the time. And what's happened, I think, Andrea, is as we become less confident, the flag and its emblem and other emblems, and of course with the double contentiousness of the Union Jack on the one hand, the Union flag that really reflects the composite nature of the British state ever since the Union of Crowns in 1604, and then the Union of England and Parliamentary Union of England and Scotland in 1707. That flag, which is extraordinary flag, unique appearance in the world, is actually a compound flag of the various saints that represent the four different nations. Sorry, let me get this right. The three different nations that was once upon a time separate kingdoms within Britain: England, Scotland, and Ireland, and that fusion of flags. As against also the even more contentious flag of St. George. Now, why has all this happened? Why has there been this change? I think if you want to go back, we've got to start talking about the very peculiar nature of both British identity, English identity, the questions of nation and nationhood. Britain was always England plus. There's one unit which is overwhelmed. This is enormous difference between England and those other multi-compound states, formerly federal states, like America. Even if you look at the 13 colonies in America, there are enough of them that the difference in size between them was actually containable within the broad structure. The problem with Britain has always been that England is overwhelmingly bigger than the rest. I mean, at the time of union with Scotland in the early 18th century, Scotland probably has a population of no more than 500,000. England is already, and it's not huge, tiny compared with France. France, remember, is already 25 million by the reign of Louis XIV at the end of the 17th century. Britain, at that point, would be about 7 million, perhaps, rising to 10 million at the end of the 18th century. But there's still this enormous disproportion of size. And that, I think, has very sharp effects. It's also that union in 1707 was both an equal and an unequal union. It resulted in Scotland merging its formal national political identity with England. That's to say, you fuse the monarchy. You'd already got a joint kingdom, joint wearer of the crown, but you extinguish the separate Scottish and indeed Scottish and English crown, though you keep the succession of English monarchs. In other words, to take a very obvious example, the late Queen Elizabeth II was Elizabeth II of England, but she was Elizabeth I of Scotland. But at the same time, the Scots, having bought in to the English political settlement, having got full representation in the Westminster Parliament, at the same time kept all the lineaments of separate nationhood. That's to say, they keep, and it is entrenched in the Act of Union, they keep their own actually separate form of Christianity, Scottish Presbyterianism, as opposed to the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. And that separation, Andrew, it's really important we realise how fundamental it is. The monarch actually changes religion when they cross the changes denomination when they cross the frontier. Similarly, Scotland preserved its own very radically different system of law, which was essentially a Roman-based law as opposed to the common law of England. It preserved its own systems of heraldry, its own separate nobility, its own separate royal court, and so on. And the result was that Britain has always been a compound nation. And I think it's really important we understand this. And I think there were also two very sharply distinct forms of nationhood that were characteristic of the old Britain. English nationhood, the dominant, was right through until the 20th century, essentially what you can call great nationhood. That's to say, it didn't much concern itself with ordinary symbols. Let me just give you an example. You're dressed very strikingly. Clothes matter enormously. If I want you to put an image in your mind of how do you know somebody is Scottish, what would you reply?
A kilt and...
Yes, national dress. They're wearing, as is very characteristic of much of Central Europe and so on. They're Switzerland itself, with a multitude of these things, different forms of traditional costume. Now, if we go back to the early 20th century, to one of the extraordinary literary political figures of early 20th century Britain, the fantasy novelist H.G. Wells, who also is a profoundly important member of the Fabian Society, the Labour Party, the envisager of new worlds, he's one of the first science fiction writers. He also writes a profoundly important history of the world, and so on. Wells comes up with this remarkable phrase that one of the glories of being an Englishman is we don't have national dress. That the peculiarity of great nationhood, nationalism, it tends to focus on institutions. It tends to be, I mean, if you look at the old English sense of itself, the mother of parliaments, the extraordinary institution. Remember this very strange Anglo-Norman word, parliament, having become pretty well universal, meaning a representative assembly. So even the French have them. They never know how to manage them because, of course, the French have never been able to manage representative assemblies. But the word has become universal. Similarly, once upon a time, because of the triumph of the Industrial Revolution, the idea of Britain as the workshop of the world, or the triumph of English common law, the world's best legal system. All of this best, top, whatever, which produces both, I suppose you could say, an arrogance. The English have a certain cool arrogance, and on the other hand, produces a certain sort of modesty, whether you could regard it as false or otherwise, that you don't need the trappings, you don't bother with them. Now, what of course happened was the consequences of ceasing to be top nation.
Uh-huh.
And I think this is something which has been a very long process, but the reality of it is really fully caught up in the early 21st century. I mean, it's manifest long, long before. I mean, if you, I don't know, have you ever read that wonderful, it's both a satire, but forgive me, I think also a profoundly serious work by Sellers and Yeatsman called 1066 and All That. You would find it it's a sort of parody on how English history was taught, particularly at prep school level, but it contains much which I think is extraordinarily clever and subtle, because remember that there is this marvelous description of the Irish question, the fact England never managed to govern Ireland sensibly, which is every time the English solved the Irish question, the Irish changed the question. Now that's pretty clever. And similarly, the end of that book, the end of Sellers and Yeatman, is the end of the First World War. And the way it goes, listen carefully, is this. Britain, this is after the this is after the Woodrow Wilson dominated settlement at Versailles, the America pushing for a Europe of nations and all the rest of it. This is what it says. Britain ceased to be top nation. This is 1918. Britain ceased to be top nation, and history came to a large full stop. Now, that I think there's a profound truth in that. It's obviously it's also a version of Fukuyama, the idea of history coming to a full stop. But the it's taken England a very, very long time for that loss of empire to have its full working out consequences. And of course, what also I think was very much part of it, it was kept, as it were, in suspense by Britain's role as not simply a victor power in the Second World War, but having been the only power that had fought Nazi Germany consistently. It was again disguised to some extent by the late Queen's interest in the Commonwealth, which acted as a kind of ghost of empire. I don't know whether you're familiar with the remarkable phrase in Thomas Hobbes when he's talking about the papacy and the Roman Empire, and he describes the papacy as the ghost of the Roman Empire sitting crowned upon the dunghill thereof. In other words, the papacy with its triple crown sitting on the ruins of the imperial city of Rome. Well, to a remarkable extent, I think the Commonwealth operated as something less cruel than Hobbes's description of the papacy, but it was a ghost which still preserved an illusion of pan-global influence, very much also embedded in the late Queen. I mean, I remember vividly, Andrea, because I'm so ancient, I remember watching her coronation on television when I was a boy of 8. And Britain at that point still seemed, there was all the appearance of this vast power, this array of every nation of the of the Commonwealth Empire. Still, we still weren't quite sure what to call it. A starring role was played in the coronation by the Polynesian Queen Salote of Tonga, who famously, it was a day of pouring rain, and she famously paraded in an open carriage with a tiny little man, presumably an equerry or God knows what he was, sitting opposite her. And there is the famous joke told by Noel Coward, when Noel Coward was asked who was the little man sitting opposite Queen Salote of Tonga, he responded, "Her lunch." So and there was the number of troops in London for that coronation procession is roughly the size of the modern British Army. And the Queen, like Queen Elizabeth I, the motto of Queen Elizabeth II could have been "Semper et adem," always the same, that unchanging face. And I think, therefore, so many of these tensions have exploded relatively recently. The death of the Queen only a few years ago tore off much of that veil. The enormous dispute over Brexit, over our leaving the European Union, opened wounds. The extraordinary extent, which is a European phenomenon, not just a specifically British one, of immigration, with, by the end of this decade, roughly 1/3 of the population will be a first or second generation immigrant. All of these things, and I would argue the thing profoundly exacerbated by a deliberate, if half concealed, almost French Revolution in terms of how we are governed, how the state works, of the very questions of our identity, carried out by the Blair government the government of Tony Blair, the new Labour government starting in 1997 and running under a separate prime minister, admittedly, but one who'd been central to this process of creating a new country out of a very old country, Gordon Brown, until 2010, but then continued and entrenched by the liberal conservatism of David Cameron and his successors. And all of these things, it seems to me, have come together very recently, and they've been driven by all of these things that, to an extent, were brushed under the carpet, becoming visible, and they've been powered, of course, by something which has afflicted virtually the whole of Europe, but has arguably been in more acute form in Britain, which is the collapse from the extraordinary boom economy of the Thatcher years into stasis and even decline. So if you put all that together, so that's the background. That's the broad background to those marches. And I think the big question, just going to your flag, I mean, how do we cut into all of that in manageable time? What's the best way into it? Well, I think it is the the question of identity. Who are people? What do they feel they are? And if you look at the Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, there you have a basic, straightforward, pretty much European form of nationalism, a blood and soil nationalism, in which things like national poets, I mean, Scotland is the old, remember, you could argue that this kind of nationalism is really invented in and for Scotland by Sir Walter Scott, who bizarrely is a unionist and a Tory, but at the height of Romanticism, and it's very important we understand this, at the height of the reaction to the universalism of the French Revolution, Walter Scott, with his great medieval novels and so on, comes up for the visit of George II to Scotland. I always get the date wrong. I can never remember this, 1821 or 22. The visit of George IV to Scotland comes up with the whole apparatus of what's called Scot Wottery. That's to say, the business of the clans, the kilt, the dress, and at the same time you begin the worship of Robert Burns's poetry, the whole the skirl of the bagpipes. The whole thing it's a kind of brilliant invocation of a specific people. You have a dress, you have a peculiar music, you have a peculiar poet, you have a peculiar flavour to the thing. Now, the English don't. Or rather, we do, because again, it is the problem of having been so incredibly successful. England, as you know, England/Britain, invents modernity. You are wearing British clothes, bizarrely, and broadly. The replacement of the dress of a French gentleman, the marvelously elaborate silk, velvet, embroidered, everything else, is at the beginning of the 20s, is at the beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, through, of course, the wars of the French Revolution, with its replacement by the English dress called the frock coat, which is in a sturdy fabric. It derives from hunting dress, but it's finely tailored. So it meant that a gentleman could actually ride publicly. It meant that he could walk without having to be in a carriage or a chair, because obviously, if you were stupid enough in the 18th century to go out dressed in court dress, it would be ripped from your back because it was precious, enormously precious fabrics. So you create a different style of dressing, and you see from the beginning of the 19th century a completely different way in which monarchs present themselves. They either wear the frock coat or they wear uniform, which itself is designed to be military uniform, designed to be sturdy and hard wearing. Then, of course, we don't have a minor poet like Robert Burns. I will now be torn apart by the Scots. We have a major one. We have Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is universal. Similarly, we don't have a dialect like Scots. We have a language which itself has become universal. As I always point out, if you want to get a sense of just how much the English actually invent the ordinary rules of not simply dress, but of living, listen to those typically French words, le weekend and le smoking. They are, these are the two things. One denominates time, the other denominates dress. But we don't think of those things now as being particularly English because they become universal. And I think this is an especial problem for the kind of people who turned out in that Tommy Robinson march, which I think is the one that you're talking about. They have none of the typical symbols. If you have a football match against the Scots, what do the thuggish Scottish supporters wear? As many of them wear a kilt and as little else as possible. But what will the English supporters wear? Well, this is a wonderful joke. In exactly the same period that the kilt is emerging as national dress for Scotland, there was actually a move to invent a national costume for England. You may be familiar with some of those amazing paintings by Thomas Gainsborough, the Blue Boy and the Red Boy. These are amongst the most famous of 18th century portraits, and they show a young man of about 1800, or a boy, early teenager, dressed in Van Dyck costume. That's the costume of the Cavaliers in the Civil War of the 17th century. So if the idea of Van Dyck dress had caught on, the English supporters would all be turning up in red and blue velvet with lace collars, which I don't think is very good uniform for having a scrap over a football match. But because they like that, because there isn't an equivalent of a bagpipes or Burns or the kind of easy symbols, which France, with a country in many ways a very similar history of a would-be world power, a would-be imperial power, the loss of all that, it's still kept much more because they're French, because French is now, following the victory of Britain in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63, French is now a minority language. It's the very fact you speak French, or indeed the fact you speak German, or the fact you speak Dutch or Swedish or whatever, is itself a badge of identity. English isn't anymore. So I think what you see with, and I hate using this word, these people, it's patronizing, it's the contempt language of the left. But I see, Andrea, a desperate sadness in this parade of polyester flags, which are usually made in China. They don't feel they've got anything else. There's still traditionally, and the great politician Disraeli understood this probably better than anybody else when he gave the vote to the working class, there's still that profound pride, xenophobic pride, in being English. But what are its contents? What's left? And there's been a deliberate campaign against that, of course. Right from the beginning of immigration in Britain, the great dispute following Enoch Powell's speech in the wake of the Race Relations Act back in 1968, there's been an absolute determination on the part of the British establishment to silence discussion of race on the one hand, that's the negative, and on the and in a much more aggressively positive fashion, from Blair onwards, there's been a deliberate propagation of the notion that, as it were, Britain as a white nation is an indecent, an old-fashioned, a dead idea, and instead we are either a community of communities or we're a multicultural one. And there is, I think, deep visceral reaction against this. But what is his content? What can they put in its place? And at the moment, it really is reduced to waving the flag of St. George. I think there's a genuine tragedy of the evacuation of meaning.
Yes, you spoke about, I mean, from a Swiss perspective, I mean, Switzerland is kind of a nation built on will, as we say, eine Willensnation, where we have various communities, French-speaking, Italian-speaking, German-speaking, Swiss German-speaking, and another language which hardly anyone speaks.
Romance, yeah.
Exactly, Romansh. So we kind of understand that because we kind of base ourselves on things that are not blood and soil nationalism, but ideas of democracy and so on. But in Britain,
careful, Andrea. Now,
yes,
is that really true? You base yourself on both because all your communities cultivate these things intensely, but they're local. They're local. And of course, you're all in it together because you're all minorities in one sense. I know there's a German-speaking majority, but you're all sort of minorities. And you have, because again, you're this patchwork of tiny, tiny little cantons, aren't you? You're, and although clearly Zurich, Geneva, whatever are bigger, there are enough of them that all of that sort of merges together. And again, because I mean, Switzerland is this very remarkable thing that it is a country which, until very far into the 19th century, was essentially still a peasant community. And what again is striking, remember, and peasant communities are precisely the ones that kept these peculiar features of national dress, different dresses for on a tiny scale, especially for women. So you can tell often even in France, even in bits of Italy, you can tell to within a few miles when people wear this, where they actually come from. Remember, England, because it's the first to modernize, because the British state, the English state, is so successful at attacking any form of separate provincial identity. It's so successful at destroying any form of clan structure. The English monarchy is so powerful, it can impose a single system of law. You have a single system broadly of education because of the enormous dominance of two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, over a whole country. You have the very early abandonment of any form of feudalism. You have the imposition of commercial tenure everywhere. All of this leads to an erosion of that genuine kind of rooted in the soil difference that we're talking about. So Switzerland, yes, as an actual functioning state. And as you know, I mean, you know much better than I do, the Sweden we have now is, although the idea of the Helvetic Republic is an old one, its current organization is very, very recent and a product of war. The Civil War, the terrible, everybody forgets it. Nobody thinks of the Swiss as having a civil war, but the Civil War of the 19th century. But you've had this immense fortune to have very recent industrialization, that it's been based on high skill, watches and whatever, high skilled industry, and so on. You haven't got the legacy of huge coal-based industrialization, all of this sort of thing. You, as I said, have preserved that sense of local rootedness, whilst at the same time being a nation, as you said, founded on will or law, and therefore peculiarly open in the way that Switzerland has been to international influence, to acting as centres of international finance and whatever. We went about that process of modernization in a wildly different fashion, and which worked profoundly well when we were top nation, but I think has become deeply problematic once we're not.
Yes, well, I'd agree with everything you said there. And I also think it's important to point out that Britain was the home and genesis of modernity as we know it. And so there is something else there, because on the one hand, you see that through the British treatment of the Scots, they were actually quite tolerant of the Scots by allowing them to have their own religion and culture and so on.
I think it's more than allowing. I mean, the negotiations in 1707 were ones which were consciously between two independent parties. And indeed, what is very clear, in many ways, in those days, the Scots were much more keen on union than many in Britain were. I mean, there was always the sense of union on the part of the English that the Scots were buying into a more successful country and were buying in, or rather not buying in, they weren't paying their way in, they were elbowing their way in to a much more successful country. And one of the principal aim of the Scots in 1707 was access to the empire. They had failed to create their own empire in the Darien scheme of creating an empire on the Isthmus of Panama. Based on the Isthmus of Panama, they'd bankrupted Scotland, which, remember, functioned as an independent state up to 1707. And at the same time, the English already engaged in what did amount to a global war against the French. They were profoundly aware that Scotland could be a back door, as Ireland so often was. That there was, again, the north of Scotland was Catholic, which opened up the possibility of easy foreign intervention from Catholic France, and there was that determination to create what was a Protestant and imperial union. And of course, that was, everybody forgets just how profoundly successful that was. And also precisely because the English never tried to turn Scotland into a colony. It's completely the other way around. I mean, the Scots become an extraordinarily important part of empire. I mean, if you look in Hong Kong and Shanghai, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank is essentially Scottish. If you look at the banking system of Canada, it's essentially Scottish. The families, the names, everything else. So much of the administrative class of empire was Scottish. So many of the regiments that defended were Scottish. And at the same time, of course, and this is very conveniently forgotten, Scotland benefited enormously from the knock-on effects of English industrialization. At the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, it's some extraordinary figure, like 70-80% of the world's shipping is built on the Clyde. Glasgow at that point is level pegging with New York. Much of central Glasgow, insofar as it survives, looks like the New York that was knocked down in the 1920s to build the skyscrapers. The great enterprise of museums in Glasgow they were conceived of on the same scale as the Metropolitan, but all of that, of course, dies with the death of coal and steel industrialization under Thatcher, and it dies with the death of the British Empire.
But there must be something else in British culture or the British experience which goes back to Parliament, where you have, well, two things sort of which I would emphasize, which also you have talked about, which is that you have an extreme emphasis with the genesis of the parliamentary system on rhetoric, reason expressed in words publicly in oratory, which is something which goes back to antiquity, which also relates to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which also has to do with the fact, which is a critique you have often advanced, which is to criticize those who always emphasize too much that we are a Judeo-Christian culture, whereas actually what they usually forget is ancient Greece and Rome. Could you perhaps speak to that?
Yes, I mean, again, what has also happened, one of the reasons for this terrible evacuation of meaning, is the loss of that pride. It seems to me that I mentioned this strange Anglo-Norman word, Parliament. England, and we must emphasize it, is England. England invents the notion of representative government. That clearly the ancient world had been able to do it on the scale of a city-state. Again, for brief periods of time, as you know, democracy in ancient Greece is a highly fragile, a very, very brief thing. The Roman Republic, a much more complex structure, lasts longer but collapses into empire and autocracy. Similarly, the Italian city-states of the Middle Ages also experiment with this, but they suffer from very, very similar problems to the Greek and Roman world. What England is able to do with this strange thing called Parliament is actually to create representative and responsible government that's on a scale big enough to deal with a large kingdom rather than a little civic state. And this, again, it's a function, isn't it, of many of the things that I was talking about, the ability of the English monarchy to impose a single law. You could only have a really functioning representative assembly if it enjoys what is technically called in Latin, you'll be familiar with it, if it enjoys the plenitudo potestatis, if it involves that fullness of control. That was the reason, of course, that the Netherlands, the United Netherlands, despite the extreme importance of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, with its Estates General and that wonderful title, their High Mightinesses, why it could never function properly, because there was no such thing as the fullness of power. Each one of the Dutch provinces had to have every decision of the United Provinces referred back to it. That means you can't really function as a state, whereas in Anglo-Britain, as we can call it, you overcome those problems. And of course, you do very quickly develop this notion that government is something to be debated. to be discussed. The idea that you have an assembly, which, if it can't agree, has got to vote, that sits from the 16th century on two sides of a narrow chapel. So, there's one side, the other side. And you can see how these ideas, if you combine it with the extraordinary fact that the English governing class is the only really large governing class in Europe, the gentry, that actually decides to go to university with the Renaissance period at the beginning of the 16th century. It's something that some people, if you look at what the medieval English schools and the English university colleges, everybody says, oh, they were founded for the education of the poor. Isn't it disgraceful they're taken over by the gentry and the nobility in the 16th century? Well, the answer is no. They were founded for the poor because they were people like me, because they were intended that the poor lads would go and run the church. And then what happens instead? In the 16th century, they are indeed taken over. So the schools become the public schools, the universities change from being essentially producing clergy to finishing off the education of the gentry and the nobility. And this, of course, gives you this extraordinary fact. You see it already emerging by the time of Shakespeare, of a genuinely educated governing class. I mean, the French nobility at this point have two nobilities. They've got the nobility of the robe, who are educated, but they're bureaucrats and administrators. And you've got the real nobility, the great titled families, who despise learning. There's the nobility of the sword. And England produces something radically, radically different. Again, you develop all sorts of things flow from this. And these seem to me to be matters of profound pride. But of course, that has been undercut as well. There is a problem with representative.
If I may cut you off there, because what is that distinctive thing which, apart from the French, the British did develop in their ruling classes? As distinct
well,
from
I think it is. Let me give you an idea. I think that you're familiar with England and you've been to London frequently. One of the things that strikes you about London are the number of statues. And again, the nature of those statues. I live, indeed, I am doing this within a very few hundred yards of the British Museum and the great squares of Bloomsbury. Now, Bloomsbury was owned by one of the great noble families that emerged into prominence at exactly the period we're talking about, at the court of Henry VIII, with the spoil of the monasteries when England breaks with Rome, and it's called the Russell family. And the Russells and those associated with them are commemorated in the great squares of Bloomsbury. Just up the road from me, there is Bloomsbury Square itself, and presiding over it, there is one of the great figures of English parliamentary politics, Charles James Fox, who dies in the early. His career straddles the French Revolution. He is both the friend and then the opponent of Edmund Burke. How is he depicted in his statue looking out from Bloomsbury Square up towards Russell Square? What dress is he shown in?
I don't know.
As a Roman senator. And almost all of these statues will show them as Roman. And what I think that the English, remember, England is historically a monarchy, but as far back as the reign of Elizabeth I, people talk of it as a royal republic. The most interesting account, and it's one of the very earliest accounts of a constitution written in Europe, is of the Constitution of England under Elizabeth. And it's anonymous, but we are pretty sure it's written by a man called Sir Thomas Smith, who was a combination of a notable academic and also a bureaucrat administrator who becomes Secretary of State, and most impressively resigns, Andrea, because he disapproves of the application of torture. torture is, again, one of the very great peculiarities of England, is we don't use torture in criminal process. You inflict hideous tortures in the forms of execution, but we don't use it as a regular part of criminal process. And he objected to it being used at all. But he writes this remarkable book called De Republica Anglorum, the Republic of the English People. And that's an account of a monarchy. And again, the English state under Elizabeth, because of course Elizabeth famously is childless and is the last of her line, is threatened by Catholic invasion, a Catholic rival claimant, Mary Queen of Scots. This is a period very much like our own, of terrorism and assassination. Famously, William of Orange, in the Netherlands, murdered by a Catholic assassin. Henry III and Henry IV in France, and so on. So the English are profoundly aware that the whole of their state hangs by the thread of Elizabeth's life. They are capable of conceiving of a state where there isn't a monarch. And they provide a machinery. Admittedly, it's only a temporary machinery, but they provide, consciously by Act of Parliament, a machinery that will keep government going, will enable the state to choose the heir, the successor that it wants, and so on. This is very, very remarkable. And again, there's a remarkable account of another corresponding development, the notion of, if you like, well, not if you like, it is the idea of the hero. And it's written by a German historian who I was associated with. He spent a lot of time in the German Historical Institute in London, Ronald Asch. And it's on the idea of, again, it's the neo-republican idea that we were in it together, that the British weren't just, this is by the time it is Britain, 1707 onwards, you're not just fighting for the king. The king isn't the only hero. There is instead the sense that this is the collective endeavor of an entire nation. And again, we incorporate all these things in very famous surviving institutions. Why is there the first National Portrait Gallery in the world in London? This is created by Palmerston, one of these great figures, the greatest foreign secretary of the 19th century, consciously modeled on that Roman Republican idea of the ancestors of the family, as the way Roman names work. So you constantly recall both your ancestors, you also recall your military victories, Germanicus or whatever it is. The English upper class incorporate this. The idea again. I mean, that astonishing spectacle. You've of course been to Westminster Abbey. This entire church taken over not by Christian symbolism, but by the statues of the English great, and you refashion it deliberately in the early 18th century. But you do so in a way which is astonishing when you rebuild the screen of the Abbey. So you have on one side, you have Newton. You've Newton symbolizing the intellectual achievement of Britain, and you've got Stanhope symbolizing the geopolitical. You create literally places for poets, for musicians. Yeah. And this is, do you understand what I mean? This is unlike anywhere else in Europe. Napoleon had to do this artificially with the Panthéon in Paris. This is something that is self-generated, and but have you noticed the problem, Andrea, is I'm using the past tense all the time. And this is why I think there has been the profound attack on the history of the West in general and the history of Britain in particular. There is a deliberate attempt at the destruction of memory. that the people depends on memory. And the story, as I've told it, is one that is profoundly impressive. But there is a deliberate determination on the part of the left to subvert it. Remember, one country in particular shows how it's possible to subvert memory, and that is Germany. The deliberate, the use, one would argue, proper use of the Holocaust to delegitimate the whole of previous German history, to, if you like, to reduce a figure that I still think remains one of the genuinely greatest statesmen, Bismarck, to a kind of monstrous prefiguration of Hitler and so on. Well, there's a very deliberate attempt at using the empire, colonialism, so-called racism, to do exactly that. And of course, it's also equally effective, as in the 1619 project, applied to the history of Britain's great successor state, the United States of America. It's deployed in Canada and Australia and New Zealand with the supposed genocide of the indigenous people and so on. And I think that what has happened is this deliberate, and it's very peculiar to the Anglo-Saxon world, this deliberate destruction of historical memory.
Yes, I mean, we see that all the time. I mean, it is clear that humans are a creature of the present, but also of the past, because if you have the present, you necessarily have a future and past. And that one, as a nation, perhaps draws one's identity from the past and can learn from it, obviously. But with all these attacks against statues, which they have torn down, with
Precisely.
with the revision of literature and its editing through modern censorial kind of inquisitors, what they are effectively doing is erasing that history, obscuring it. They're waging war on it in a certain sense. And in that sense, you might apply Orwell's phrase, who controls the past controls the present, and thereby perhaps the future, which is deeply authoritarian. So how would you analyze that in specific?
Well, I think you're right. You see, but I think we've got to explain why this is so much more prominent in the Anglo-Saxon world than it is, say, in France, or, I mean, France is a bit catching up, isn't it? But so much more prominent than, say, it is in Spain or Italy or whatever. Why? I think, again, it's the peculiar consequence of the spectacular success of what we could call, in this case, Anglo-America. Because what happened with Anglo-America in the 19th and the 20th century, and right through, and I think absolutely culminating in 1945, and the victory over Germany, and the determination, of course, to hold the leaders of Nazi Germany accountable for what we regard as their crimes, and to hold them accountable not simply, as I think it's Goering argues most eloquently at the Nuremberg trials, not simply as victor's justice, but justice against the natural, or as justice for crimes committed against the natural order. I think what is striking is, and you can see it first with England's imposition of free trade effectively on the world. Remember, the British Empire is the beginning of globalization. It's for the first time you can genuinely conceive of the world as a single place, with, of course, that extraordinary vehicle of the British Navy, which is the first force in the history of the world that was capable of functioning equally effectively in the North Sea and off Polynesia. This extraordinary thing, and becomes even more marked with America. And I think that what we do is we espouse that dangerous French notion coined above all during the French Revolution of universalism, and we proclaim most what's the word I want, hubristically I suppose, in Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history. We proclaim that those virtues of parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, and all the rest of it are universal. But of course, the moment you do that, Andrea, you then open yourself to the charge, you don't really practice what you preach. And you see, I think that's been the problem. That from the very beginning, and I think we need, you were very kind in your introduction to me to highlight, which I think are two aspects of how I try to think. One is the need for extraordinary specificity and precision in the use of evidence, and the other is what often flies in its face, the ability to draw large themes and to make big arguments. And it seems to me that what we can see, and I would like to recommend everybody, I have no idea whether you've read it, have you read Machangama's work on freedom of speech?
Not yet, but it's on my bookshelf.
Is on your bookshelf, you must, because it is a genuinely his essay really gets you the essence, because what he does, he demonstrates that the thing that in a sense destroys the world is the fact, and Churchill knew it, that you destroy Germany by fighting with Stalin. And right from the beginning, because Russia is, of course, admitted as not simply an equal, but one of the dominant partners of the post-Second World War settlement and the United Nations and UNESCO and everything else, you have a power there that is determined to subvert. And they spotted right from the beginning that the way to destroy the West was to take its values seriously, but to accuse it of not fulfilling them. And they spot right from the beginning three key ideas. The charge of fascism enables you to resist the notion of freedom of speech. As you know, in so much of Germany, Austria, and whatever, it is actually illegal to either belong to a fascist party or to say, for example, that the Holocaust didn't happen. And this is why the word fascist is so universally used on the left, because the Soviets, and they use it directly. If you look at, and what Machangama shows is, if you look at how the United Nations Declaration on Universal Human Rights and the key right to freedom of speech, how it's modified and shaped by the time of the convention of the 1970s. It's done through the Soviets and their satellites using this idea, we mustn't give free speech to fascists, mustn't we? Because they undercut all the nice things that we want. That is how you develop the doctrine of hate speech, which is, of course, the way in which one of the ways in which the West has been most effectively destroyed. He shows that brilliantly, how those extraordinary statements from the People's Republic of Bulgaria or the People's Republic of Romania, places that had no notion of freedom, how are cited years and years later in the 1990s by women, it's always women, at Berkeley, California, in the Berkeley Law School, to formulate the doctrines of hate speech, which are used as the essential vehicle of the left. And similarly, the other two key Soviet ideas were imperialism and racism. And these things are used to undercut the authenticity of the West and to say, you pretend to all these grand ideas, you're corrupt. You actually believe in the opposite of them. You believe in domination and exploitation. And I think this is, it is, if you like, I mean, this is Wagnerian, isn't it? It's your very triumph, the very triumph of the Anglo-American world, which has offered the seeds of its destruction.
Yes, that is very interesting in the sense that we have sort of submitted to the Soviet Union's take on free speech and whom it should be given to and not to fascists and so on. And I would also, because as the Americans recognize, free speech has to be for all or it is for none to a maximal degree. But one of the important things as well is, on the one hand, the seeds of destruction were sown kind of in the success of the Western civilization and its hubris, but also, in a certain sense, if you just take logically these arguments by woke postmodern thinkers that we mustn't impose Western values on other cultures, the only justification they can bring for it is that it violates their human rights, which of course is a Western value in and of itself. So that's inherently self-contradictory in a certain sense. Another thing one might point to is that, and this is not necessarily subversion by the Soviet Union, because there was a great part of our own culture, particularly the elites, which harmonized with this view, which is a fundamentally anti-democratic strain, an elitism, a technocracy idea, which goes back to Plato's philosopher kings, which they tied to, in a specific sense, historically specific, to Hitler's rise. And they made Hitler's rise the responsibility of democracy. In other words, it was the fault of democracy that Hitler came to power, which of course is a complete historical distortion, because that election that he won, well, he imprisoned his opposition, he censored them, he had thugs on the street. I could win elections like that too, but it wouldn't be a democratic victory.
Continue.
Yes. So, and that led, I think, to the birth of the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Union, which was always a mechanism. And we experienced this particularly strangely in Switzerland, where, for instance, we have a vote on mass immigration in 2014, where the people by majority, pretty overwhelming majority, decide to put quotas on immigration. So how many people come in is settled by a quota. Our parliament then, by the time they have to implement it 2 years later in 2016, refuses to implement that vote on the basis of those international agreements with the EU, where they say that, oh, but if we cancel free movement, then the guillotine clause will fall down on our agreements with the EU and cancel everything we have, basically, in that agreement package. But we only voted on quotas on immigration, but not on cancelling everything. So they're using those international agreements to stifle democracy, to say there is a higher power above the people. In a similar sense, the EU, I would say that, all those four freedoms of the EU, even if 80% of the French people were for restricting immigration from other EU countries, they could not implement that will because they are a member of the EU, effectively meaning that if you are a member of the EU as a nation, you are no longer a democracy, which in itself is a sufficient reason to commit Brexit or leave the EU as such, which is something many people didn't understand, that it's not about economics, it's not about being rich or poor or about the technicalities, it's about a fundamental issue as a sufficient reason to leave.
Agreed, but I would go even further, Andrea. If you want an example of this, we've actually, you use this primitive word. Now, I don't expect you to be primitive, sophisticate that you are. You use this primitive word, democracy, without a qualifying adjective. The triumph of the kind of people you're talking about is they've actually inverted the meaning of the word democracy. Liberal democracy now means restraining the majority to protect the minority. You've literally inverted language. And the moment at which all this became clear, and the fact that this is really a worldwide struggle, was, do you remember the extraordinary moment when J.D. Vance spoke in Munich, and the German chairman of the meeting heroically dissolved in tears? Now, but what you were dealing with there were two radically different meanings of the word democracy. Europe has decided that democracy effectively means restraining popular opinion, which is why you've had to come up with this abusive term, populist, which is just really the Latin for democracy. One comes from demos, the Greek for people. The other comes from the populist, the Latin term. But the democracy, liberal democracy, good; populism, bad. Whereas, particularly on the MAGA side of America, the old meaning of democracy, i.e. rule of the majority, still hangs on, though of course sharply critiqued by the Democrats. And I think it is this extraordinary paradox, isn't it, that a party that calls itself the Democrats actually disapproves of democracy. I mean, but we are in that sense in a genuinely postmodern world. But I would argue that the reason we began talking about Britain, and let's end at this point, and then we will continue the conversation later. The reason I think that there is this a very specific problem in Britain, and even more specifically in England, is because all of these ideas, these bizarre notions of the limitation of democracy and whatever, were imposed on the country. We don't invent democracy, but what we do invent is the idea of representative government, and they're imposed, which itself, of course, means that the old British state, the British Ancien Régime, uniquely in Europe, is capable of adapting to a broadening franchise without having to break up. So we can reform ourselves rather than revolutionize ourselves. In 1832, when you broaden the franchise roughly to the liberal middle class, and in 1867, when you broaden the franchise to the conservative working class, all within the same constitution. In other words, you're pouring very, very new electoral wine into old constitutional bottles. But what happened, Andrea, under Blair was precisely an extreme form of this attack on the notion of government responding to the popular will. Under Blair, you get a neo-French Revolution, or indeed a neo-German 1945 constitution imposed on Britain, and particularly on England, with the creation, on the one hand, of the bureaucratic state of what we call the quangos, the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, and in which, beginning with the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, the Climate Change Committee, English Nature, in which committees of experts run at least a third of the economy. And of course, during COVID, we were entirely run by a Platonic committee that actually called itself SAGE, the Committee of Scientists, and I would call them numerologists rather than, in other words, frauds rather than statisticians. They call themselves medical statisticians and epidemiologists, that ran us into the ground during COVID. And then on the other hand, we've imported an extreme doctrine of universal human rights, of course, first formulated in the French Revolution, which fundamentally declares itself to be anti-democratic. You believe in a universal human being. So the specificities of being British or English don't apply. The specificities of being foreign and native don't apply. There should be no frontiers. And all of this has this shattering effect on identity, on history, on belonging. And so I think that and I think the sense of rupture is particularly acute in Britain. Remember, uniquely, and it is uniquely, the Anglo-British state genuinely, I'm now not just talking about the succession of the monarchy, but has genuinely an unbroken political succession of 800 years, going back to Magna Carta. There is the rupture of the Civil War of the 17th century, but it's deliberately knitted up with this unique act of a country that had undergone revolution, reversing it without foreign intervention. But what Blair does is to superimpose on this ancient state this bizarre neophiliac, gimcrack, plastic, pseudo-European structure at the same time as opening the gates of immigration. So he is able to do what, there'd always been attempts, revolutionary attempts from the French Revolution onwards, of remolding the people. Blair is the first person not simply to be able to remold the institutions, but actually to remold the population. And that, to bring us full circle, Andrea, is what those people were marching about. They didn't fully know it, but they felt it in their bones.
Yes. I mean, those are incredibly interesting thoughts. I do think that a lot of our elites hide their disdain for democracy behind their contempt for populism. And I really don't like that. And I also think, what you were saying about universal human rights is absolutely right, because it has been used as an excuse to subvert the national democratic order. In a sense, this is also my critique of people like Benedict Anderson and his book Imagined Communities, because I think it de-emphasizes the idea that, British people are not responsible for the rights of Chinese people in China. That's not our responsibility. And in a
It
certain
really isn't.
exactly.
It really isn't.
And
It really.
and often, a sense of national belonging also stemmed from, and I think this is underanalyzed by people like Benedict Anderson, from, in the 18th, 17th, 16th century, the French had to contend with their nobility, with their king, but not with the English monarchy or with the Chinese so much. And that's, us against them, or we have grievances against our king or our nobility. That over time does form a sense of community and national identity. That in itself is way underanalyzed, I think. And so with those incredibly interesting thoughts for the basis of a next discussion, Mr. David Starkey, the best historian in Britain, thank you very much.
You're too kind. A great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.